Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you, Chairman, for this wonderful introduction. It's very hard to present today because everyone want to go, and before lunch, no one is interested, basically. لكن I will do my best to be on time. Dr. Khalaf told me 20 minutes or less. I'll try to be fast. However, I want to draw your attention to a very important part. The most important part is some of the presentation content has not been published, and they are under final revision, a final review at the moment before going to publication. So this is as fresh as you can get. Okay, so no relevant disclosures, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever. So I think the biggest question with cardiovascular disease is, why should we care as a rheumatologist in lupus? Why? And we care simply because when you look at the causes of mortality, which is the worst ultimate outcome of our patient, is cardiovascular disease represent one of the leading causes of mortality. This is a very famous study by Urwitz that looks at the causes of mortality over decades. And there is a follow-up study after 2001 that showed basically the same thing. But in that study, you will see that the first major cause of death is lupus nephritis related, an infection. And then after that, you will see cardiovascular risk as a major cause. And though this cause has been trending down with the development of cardiovascular disease, still remain a leading cause of death. So we should care. Now, the second part, which is very important, is that when you look at the follow-up of those patients until 2013, you'll see that the patient age, expected age, unexpected life expectancy of a patient with lupus, although it has been improving over time, still much lower than the average population. And this is really bad for someone who's 20 years old. So when you talk with a 20 years old saying that we're likely to live much shorter than others, that's a devastating information. So question, what can we do about that? Now, this is a very important part that show you, many people will say, well, over time, our understanding of cardiovascular disease and the way we treat has been much, much better. So theoretically, the risk of cardiovascular disease over time in the population has been going down. And that is correct. If you look at these two graphs, the one on the bottom shows that the risk of cardiovascular disease over time has been improving in the overall population. However, lupus patients still have about 3-fold higher cardiovascular burden. And this is what this table is showing. The second question is, well, okay, are all cardiovascular diseases in lupus the same? Are all atherosclerosis based? Do they occur late at the stage of patient life or not? This graph is a wonderful graph. It calls the standardized mortality rate. What does it show? When you compare lupus patient within age group to their corresponding population-based age in terms of causes of death, you will see that the highest risk, early age. So you should freak out, well, you should not freak out, but you should be really careful and vigilant with your younger population because those populations are the highest risk of mortality early on the disease, which tell you, is that atherosclerosis or not? Okay, so we divide cardiovascular causes of mortality in lupus into 3 major areas. I have an interest in that, but we'll talk about that later. But cardiovascular disease is a major part. The second part is infection, and the third part is a damage accrual, and you will hear a lot about that. And if you go to a lupus specialized clinic or a rheumatology clinic, you will see that there is a major focus on damage accrual and prevention. Hence, the early utilization of disease-modifying drugs, as we will define that later on. Now, the first part is to understand what is the cardiovascular disease causes in order to tackle them in the proper way. This is a very interesting study that shows basically the impact of atherosclerosis and lupus with patient. Bottom line, patient with lupus has accelerated atherosclerosis, i.e. they tend to have more plaque than general population and eventually earlier or faster atherosclerosis. And you can see that that burden increased as you go on age, which means in your population of lupus, there are likely to be 2 types of cardiovascular pattern. Early on, at younger age, major problem, we'll talk about that later. And later on, atherosclerosis base, and that seems to be slightly higher than the general population, and likely to be related to the burden of disease, including inflammation and medication and whatnot. Now, if this is true, and our framework is right, we should have an evidence to support that. This basically study in a population-based population-based study that shows basically the same pattern that I'm telling you, which is the burden of vascular events over time. And you see that the burden predominantly, the two curves separate early on in age, which means that there is the highest burden comes at early age, and highest burden coming from a thrombotic process more than atherosclerosis. Now, if you believe me on that, the data, when you stratify patient based on age, you should see that the highest risk is at younger age, and this is exactly what that table shows. Now, the question is, what do we know about our Saudi population? Unfortunately, and that with a great sadness, I have to say that about 1/3 of our patients at risk of cardiovascular disease, our national strategy focus on cardiovascular prevention. Okay, so that's what every one in the ministry or transformation is focused on. Now, the reason is that about 25 to 1/3 of the population at risk of cardiovascular disease. How did we get this information? We have a luxury, well, we have a wonderful resource of information, comes from something called Pure Study. Pure Study is an international study that looks at the prospective urban and rural disease, epidemiological disease study that looks at the causes of death and cardiovascular causes of death in a general population that has no problems. And they look at them in cities and outside the city. The in Saudi chapter has about 2,000 patients for more than now almost 10 years of surveillance. They follow them over time and they look at them over time. And what that study showed is that about the risk, the prevalence of major adverse cardiovascular event is about 3.5% of the general population. Tamam? Now, the driver is the traditional cardiovascular risk, and you know that. Now, the question is, what about lupus patients? So what we did, we said that we have a wonderful opportunity in the Saudi national perspective with lupus, predominantly hosted at King Saud University, where we actually been observing patients for the last 4 years from 2020. Dr. Al-Khalaf is one of the founders of this study before he ditched us to King Faisal. And during this period of time, we observe our patients regularly for major cardiovascular events. So we said, well, in order to understand the process, we need to compare at the same time period our lupus patient to the general population who tend to have no lupus at all, and see whether the difference in MACE exists, i.e. we are worse or the same to the general population. Two, what drives this? And this is the basis of this of our study. What we shows here is that the prevalence of MACE in our study over 3 years is 4.9%. So that's much higher than the 3.5 that I mentioned. And what is interesting is like, okay, cool. Is that explained by traditional risk factor or something else? Because at the clinic, the usual teaching is that you need to look at diabetes, dyslipidemia, hypertension for your patient. Well, would that cut the risk or not? Surprise, surprise. So what we did is we looked at, this table shows actually the difference between lupus cohort and the pure. After matching and doing the proper statistic, take my word for that, I spent a lot of time on doing this. The study shows that basically, regardless of the way you define MACE, or major adverse cardiovascular event, you tend to have much higher risk with lupus compared to pure. And what is more interesting is that what drives this risk is not the traditional risk factors. So your diabetes, hypertension, obesity are not the primary driver. What drives this risk factor is actually lupus-related factor. Now, when you break down lupus-related factor and you include the damage index and the disease activity and whatnot, you tend to see the driver of that. Now, I have to remind you that the damage index include cardiovascular components, so you need to remove it, and we did that. Now, the point here is that, well, now we understand that the major driver of our lupus population, major cardiovascular event, is lupus-related factor. What is it exactly, and how we can tackle this? And for later age, it is the atherosclerosis. Can we do something about that? Now, we have, this is the framework that I want you to keep in mind leaving this room. Cardiovascular events that happen in lupus tend to have two major parts. An inflammation-driven process in which thrombosis is the major driver, and that seems to dominate the majority of the risk early on that is related to the disease. So we need to tackle that part. Second part is happened later stage where you have the atherosclerotic-related traditional risk factor compared to the general population, okay? Now, why this is important, when you look at risk scores that predict cardiovascular risk, they suck. Their performance is horrible. And the reason is that they actually use traditional risk factor with a little bit of non-traditional risk factor, and they pull everyone together. Well, that's why the major contribution of our paper is that we are saying we need to build risk factor that takes that doesn't take age as a risk or as a one variable, but do that or take that in a different statistical way in order to predict people in a better way. Now, this is a great study by Urowitz that tried to use Framingham's risk score in order to identify those at risk. Basic finding is that when you do traditional risk factor Framingham score, your performance is not great. When you multiply by 2, maybe you'll have a risk, which means this 2 is likely coming from your lupus, the diagnosis of lupus. Michelle Petrie did the same thing, and what she found in this study that there are certain factors that she needed to include in the calculator, and you will see some of the traditional risk and some of which is disease-related, i.e. low complement, antiphospholipids. But these findings, which is not doesn't match our finding, is presented here to show you that this is true only when you look at one factor at a time. Yani if I look at hypertension and cardiovascular risk, yeah, I find the association. But when you take everything and adjust for it, you don't really see the association of significance with the traditional risk score. Now, the second part, home message, since the major driver of early age is disease activity, we need to have a lot of work on disease control. But the question is, what does that actually mean and what is the evidence? I'm going to skip that for the sake of time, but what is very important, the most important part, seems to be steroid. Steroid, in addition to the inflammation, so inflammation could promote thrombosis. However, steroid by itself, when you control for disease, is a major risk for thrombotic event. And what is very interesting about this big national study is that when you look at it's not just the cumulative dose and how long do you put patient on steroid. It's also how high do you put them early on at a spot. Now that's a word of caution when we use pulse as yani candy. Well, some people promote pulse as yani whatever. That's not really super safe, just to keep this in mind. And in fact, it does trigger or put people at risk of thrombosis. So you need to take this with a grain of salt. Second part is hydroxychloroquine. This medication is magic for lupus, but you all know that. What is very interesting is that it does two things, and keep this in mind when it comes to the lipid profile. One, it does improve your lipid profile and insulin sensitization. And why I say that? Because when we looked in our study between the difference between lupus and non-lupus, and we look at the lipid profile, we look at the performance, some of the differences in the lipid profile tend to be related to the fact that our patient predominantly lose hydroxychloroquine versus the general population. But further analysis is awaiting, and more study on that field will be presented later on. Second, the evidence comes from Michelle Petrie work on hydroxychloroquine. Basically, whenever the level goes down, your risk of thrombosis goes up. So you need to keep the hydroxychloroquine level in good shape. The problem is, dosing does not predict the level. So when you put people on 400 milligram, doesn't guarantee that the level is actually 400. And the best way is to measure it. Now we are trying to develop that test for commercialization في الجامعة. But until then, you can't measure it in Saudi. When we develop it, please send patients. We love commercial business model between sectors. Now, second part, is very important, is the steroid, the cholesterol. One of the major struggles that I face in the clinic when patients with lupus have high cholesterol, is it their familial hypercholesteremia or true cholesterol elevation, or the cholesterol elevated because of inflammation, or is the steroid that's making the difference, or what exactly? Now, there are work in progress that we finished the analysis for, and we'll present later on to address that problem. But what I want you to highlight here is that cholesterol seems to have, lowering cholesterol seems to be beneficial, particularly in patients with high steroid. So just keep this in mind. So particularly when you put people on steroid, keep the lowering cholesterol as an important target. Now, statin has a big controversy in the field of cardiovascular prevention in lupus. I'm not going to go into the detail, but the bottom line of every evidence there is the following. Statin may change the atherosclerosis burden in someone who has established atherosclerosis. But when you bring patients who are young, has inflammation initially and no plaque, and put them on statin, you are unlikely to see a difference. And this is what the trial that Michelle Betry showed. She showed no difference in intimal thickening in people on statin or no statin. However, the problem is when you stratify for those who have plaque, existing plaque, you'll see change over time in the intimal thickening. So take this in consideration. I highly advise, well, if you have the opportunity to do a vascular study, look for plaque, and anyone who has a plaque, feel free to put them on statin. Follow the general recommendation of general population until we have more evidence and insight. Now, I need to wrap things up, and what basically the other factors that what the study here is showing is basically how statin particularly could be helpful in other people with end-stage renal disease, traditional risk factors and whatnot. And of course, hypertension management. I just want to draw your attention that the more stringent definition of hypertension control in lupus you take, the less likely you have events. So we know the relevantly recent guidelines that shows hypertension definition 130/80, and how is some controversy happened there. Bottom line is, in this study that comes from Toronto, shows that when you are more than 140, over 90, definitely you have higher risk. When you are less than 130/80, you have a better risk than just 140. But the message is control hypertension as much as you can, and I can guarantee you that we're not doing a great job, and there are a lot of data that shows that even in specialized center. Now, summary, on time. I should take the award of being on time. Cardiovascular disease is a complex process in lupus. Definitely, there are more than one pathophysiology for it. The problem early on seems to be inflammation driven with the thrombosis, and the trick is how to control that, avoiding excessive risky medication like steroid. In contrary, later on, it is likely to be related to atherosclerosis and damage arterial. And what is very important to keep in mind is to have tight control of traditional risk factor in those who have established cardiovascular evidence, such as having a plaque thickening, in the intima, or thickening intima in their ultrasound findings. And with that, I would like to thank my patients, my team, our cohort, as well as everyone who contributed and decided to go to a different institute. Thank you so much.